Hey, 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 apes, welcome back. And here is to another unit with Miss Hoskins. This time we're on water pollution, my favorite. Water pollution is 5 parts. First, we're going to talk about wastewater from humans and livestock, and then talk about the heavy metals and other chemicals that can pollute water. We'll have to definitely mention oil pollution, and then non-chemical water pollution, which is an interesting topic. And then we're going to wrap it all up with legislation. You guessed, water pollution laws. Our country's water quality improves when citizens demand it, and the country is affluent enough at this point that it can afford measures to clean up pollution, and it can take steps to prevent it in the future. So I think we need to now talk about the U.S. laws that protect water from pollution and ensure safe drinking water. And we need to examine those laws. So in this section, be able to explain the Clean Water Act and how it protects against water pollution, discuss the goals of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and understand how water pollution legislation is changing in developing countries. Even as recently as 1960s, water quality in our country was very poor across the board. But this growing awareness of the problem has encouraged a series of laws in order to fight water pollution. And the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948 was the first major piece of legislation affecting water quality. And in 1972, that act was expanded into the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act supports the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on actual bodies of water. And by maintaining and, when necessary, restoring the chemical, physical, biological properties of surface waters, the Clean Water Act has included all of those components. However, it really, even though maybe you thought that it might, its objective was not to include the protection of groundwater. So the Clean Water Act originally focused mostly on the chemical properties of surface waters, but more recently it has led to this increase in focus on ensuring the biological properties of, of of water are protected, and it's gaining attention. In even the biological properties that include like the abundance and the diversities of all the various species that are in that particular body of water. So most importantly, the Clean Water Act issued water quality standards that defined acceptable limits and various pollutant categories in all of U.S. waterways. So, to help enforce those limits, the Act allowed the EPA and state governments really to issue permits to control how much pollution industries can discharge into the water. And over time, more and more categories of pollutants have been brought under that jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. And now it includes things like animal feedlots and storm runoff, things like that. All right, so in addition to this Clean Water Act, there's other legislation that has been passed to regulate water pollution, and part of it is the Safe Drinking Water Act. In 1974, 1986, and 1996, there was a set of standards that were set for safe drinking water. So, under the Safe Drinking Act, the EPA is responsible for establishing a maximum contaminant level. We call that an MCL, and that's for 77 different elements or substances in both surface water and in groundwater. That list includes well-known microorganisms that cause disease, disinfectants, organic chemicals, inorganic chemicals. There's a lot. So the maximum concentrations are considered both in and out of the actual water system. So we need to figure out what the feasible limit is for causing harm and regulate up until that concentration. So these MCLs are somewhat subjective, and they're subject to a lot of political pressure too. Despite the evidence that 50 ppbs of arsenic causes harm to humans, the MCL for arsenic was kept at 50 for many years. And because of concerns by many communities that could not afford to reduce the level to 10 ppbs, uh, most of the time those laws just went unregulated. So we had to talk about earlier in this section that these MCLs for arsenic were finally reduced to 10 ppbs in 2001. So, look, governments had to spend some money on this. And what we've been impacting these water pollution laws for a long time is that, in general, they've been pretty successful. The EPA defines a water body in terms of its designated use, including aesthetics. Like, they can't just make it look ugly. Is it used for recreation? Is it used to protect fish? And is it a source of safe drinking water? So the EPA determines, in particular, how valuable that water support system is. So according to most recent EPA data, 56% of all streams and 35% of lakes and ponds and 70% of bays and estuaries in the U.S. are now fully supported by their laws. And this is a large improvement from decades in the past. You can see here in this particular table how some of those contaminant levels have gone to absolutely zero. Giardia, for instance, is a microorganism that causes severe diarrhea, and it's very dangerous. So, you know, the maximum level that the municipality that produces your drinking water will allow inside of your drinking water is 0. Now, some of this stuff like mercury, they can't always pull every single bit of it out, but it does have a pretty small parts per billion measurement. So from this diagram, you can see the impairments by streams and rivers, lakes, ponds, and even reservoirs, the causes of those impairments and the sources of them. And even though we've made a lot of improvements, this table shows that we still have a lot of work to do in order to improve our waterways. I mean, today the water in that comes out of the municipality, those water systems in the U.S., I mean, they're generally safe. But water regulations have greatly reduced contaminations of in waters and nearly basically eliminated major point source of pollution. But non-point source like oil from parking lots and nutrients and pesticides and suburban lawns, they're not really covered under these existing regulations. So there's additional stuff to be done. If we look at water pollution legislation around the world, there is a clear difference between a developed and a developing country. So a developed country like North America and Europe, they have experienced tremendous amount of industrialization for many, many decades. And there's widely polluted areas, and they have widely polluted air and water. But more recently, we have addressed the problems of polluting by cleaning up polluted areas and by passing laws to prevent pollution in the future. But developing countries are still in the process of, industrializing. And they are less able to afford, water quality improvements like wastewater treatment plants. And so the cost that's associated with their legislation is not reasonable. Plus political instability and corruption oftentimes make legislation very difficult. In some cases, contaminating industries move from developed countries to developing countries. And although developing countries suffer from the additional pollution, they also benefit economically from the additional jobs and the spreading of new industry in their country. So water pollution problems are prevalent in many developing nations too, like Africa and Asia and Latin America, and even large parts of Eastern Europe. China and India, for example, have undergone rapid industrialization and have had many areas of this dense human population. And so, that is what we call a recipe for major water pollution problems. As a nation becomes more affluent, people often show more interest in the environment and resources and their availability. So they start to address environmental issues. Like in Brazil, industrialization began to take off in the 1950s. And by the 1990s, one of their major rivers was part of which was part of their largest city, was very badly polluted, and more than a million Brazilians signed a petition in 1992 requesting that the government regulate that polluted river. And so the industrial and the municipal pollution, they had begun dumping stuff into this river, but the citizens were able to get legislation passed to get it cleaned up. And so, it's just another example how things are changing. Sometimes affluency is better for the people, but then it begins to lead to some problems. I often wondered what is the significance of that maximum contaminant level anyway, that MCL. The maximum contamination levels for 77 different elements were set under that Safe Drinking Water Act that was in like 1974. And so the maximum concentrations that we consider are both like not only the concentration of each compound, but whether or not it's going to cause harm or not, and is it feasible to reduce the cost of this, or is reducing the compound in such a concentration even worth it financially? It's just leads me to believe that somehow, some way, that there's definitely some holes in this. What are the two most important water pollution laws in the U.S. anyway? What do they even do? In the U.S., the most important water pollution law is definitely the Clean Water Act, and you should know that and memorize that. You should also know the Safe Water Drinking Act. The Clean Water Act supports the protection and propagation of fish. It also includes like shellfish and wildlife and recreation. And propagation, their ability to reproduce, means that if we can't provide them enough water, we have to provide them facilities in order to carry on their reproduction. So we can't just have enough oxygen for fish to live there. We have to have a system that's in place so that they can breed happily and not necessarily be happy, but you understand what I mean. Carry on all of life's functions, So by maintaining all of these things in these two particular laws, that when it's necessary, we need to restore these chemical, physical, biological properties of surface waters. And that Safe Water Drinking Act, that legislation sets this national standard for safe drinking water. And that's important because it established a maximum contaminant level for 77 different substances that were thought to be extremely harmful to humans. And that started to cover both like the surface water and the groundwater. Because up until that one point, groundwater was not included in all of that. I guess I should also mention that sometimes students oftentimes think that we're safe because those laws are in place, but it's just not true. In fact, you can look up Georgia's contamination lawsuit information, and you can see that there are current lawsuits going on in Georgia everywhere. That there are facilities that they have believed that give people like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, cancers, stomach cancers, leukemia, all kinds of stuff, pancreatic cancer, kidney cancer, just lots of things. And like even Cobb and like Noonan counties, they will have maps on where these places were that released toxins or gases into the air. And there's always people out there. The EPA, even though they don't have everything covered, studies take like decades in order to expose manufacturing plants and facilities that are emitting all of these harmful chemicals. And so this goes on all the time. And there was just one just recently this year, a current lawsuit. And not everyone hops on board because they don't know how to find it in their area and see if anything was done, to compensate the people who were exposed to those types of toxins. But just don't feel safe and secure for a law that was passed, 25, 35, almost 40 years ago. I mean, it constantly needs to be investigated and looked at and researched.